I studied every documented detail of Epstein's network and compared it to MGM's alleged 1930s operations. And the parallels are absolutely terrifying. What you're about to see isn't just two scandals. It's proof of an institutional blueprint that's been hiding in plain sight for 90 years. When Golden Age glamour masked dark secrets. Between 1930 and 1960, Hollywood's studio system didn't just control movies. It controlled everything. 5 major studios owned the theaters, the distribution, and most importantly, the stars themselves, through contracts that were basically ownership papers for 7 years straight. But here's what your film history classes never taught you. Behind those glossy publicity photos and red carpet premieres was an operation that modern prosecutors would recognize immediately. According to film historians E.J. Fleming and Mark Elliott, MGM wasn't just making movies. They were allegedly running what amounted to an elite escort service using aspiring actresses. These aren't wild conspiracy theories from the internet. These accounts come from documented research in Mark Elliott's Jimmy Stewart, a biography, and E.J. Fleming's The Fixers, Eddie Mannix, Howard Strickling, and the MGM publicity machine. According to their findings, MGM operated facilities adjacent to their Culver City studio that catered to specific preferences of male stars and studio executives. The similarities to modern cases are bone-chilling. Like Epstein's network, with its private jets and luxury properties, MGM used its entertainment empire to create a system of exploitation. Like the allegations against Sean Combs and his parties, these operations relied on power dynamics, coercion, and the silence of victims who had nowhere to turn for help. But unlike Epstein's Island or contemporary scandals, MGM's operations stayed hidden for nearly 90 years. Tonight, we're finally telling that story. When aspiring starlets faced Hollywood's darkest reality. If you want to understand how MGM's alleged network operated, you need to hear Patricia Douglas's story. What happened to this 20-year-old dancer in 1937 wasn't just a crime. It was a window into how the entire system worked. May 2nd, 1937. Patricia thought she was answering a routine casting call for MGM dancers. Instead, she walked into what can only be described as an elite entertainment operation designed to exploit vulnerable women for powerful men's pleasure. The setup was sophisticated. 120 young women had been brought to entertain 300 male Chicago exhibitors, the theater owners who decided which films played across America. These weren't random party guests. They were the most powerful people in the entertainment distribution network. According to Vanity Fair's comprehensive investigation, the women had been completely deceived. They believed they were auditioning for legitimate roles. Instead, they found themselves trapped at a Wild West-themed party where they were expected to serve as entertainment for wealthy men. Without phones or transportation, escape was practically impossible. What happened next reveals the calculated nature of these operations. David Ross, a 36-year-old MGM salesman from Chicago, singled out Patricia after she demonstrated a popular dance called truckin'. Ross and an accomplice forcibly held her down, pinched her nose to force her mouth open, and poured an entire glass of scotch and champagne down her throat. When Patricia began to lose consciousness, Ross slapped her awake, snapping, "Cooperate! I want you aware." Ross then dragged the semi-conscious Patricia to a parked car where he committed the assault. Around 11:30 p.m., parking attendant Clement Soth heard screams and saw Patricia staggering toward him, her eyes swollen shut. "My God," she moaned. "Isn't anything sacred around here?" Soth witnessed Ross fleeing the scene, testimony that would later be suppressed through bribery. But here's where the story gets truly revealing about institutional power. Patricia was taken to Culver City Community Hospital, where she received what can only be described as evidence destruction, disguised as medical care. Before any forensic examination, hospital staff performed a cold water douche that eliminated any physical evidence of the assault. This wasn't medical negligence. It was the first step in a cover-up that had clearly been planned in advance. MGM's response was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, they launched what Vanity Fair called a blame the victim smear campaign unparalleled in Hollywood to this day. The studio hired operatives from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the nation's oldest and largest private security company, to track down every woman who attended the party and coerce them into supporting MGM's version of events. The Pinkertons systematically intimidated witnesses. They convinced other dancers to testify that the party was good, clean fun, and that Patricia was known as a heavy drinker. They bribed key witness Clement Soth, offering him any job he wanted at MGM, in exchange for recanting his testimony that identified Ross as Patricia's attacker. The studio's influence extended throughout Los Angeles' power structure. District Attorney Buren Fitts, who was completely in the pocket of the producers, according to screenwriter Bud Schulberg, refused to pursue the case aggressively. The Los Angeles Police Department, which had extensive financial relationships with the studios, failed to conduct a proper investigation. MGM even suppressed physical evidence. The studio had filmed the party, a one-reel movie that captured the evening's events. This film was immediately locked away in MGM's vaults and never seen again. Without this evidence, it became Patricia's word against the studio's carefully orchestrated narrative. The legal outcomes were predictable. The Los Angeles grand jury declined to indict David Ross. Patricia filed a $500,000 civil lawsuit in Los Angeles County Superior Court, but it was dismissed on February 9, 1938. She then filed an identical suit in federal court, alleging deprivation of civil rights. But that, too, was dismissed for want of prosecution, when neither Patricia's lawyers nor MGM's attorneys appeared in court, suggesting the case had been settled behind closed doors. David Ross never faced any consequences. He returned to Chicago and lived the rest of his life unprosecuted for a crime that multiple witnesses had observed. Patricia Douglas, meanwhile, was effectively blacklisted from the entertainment industry. Her confidence shattered, her reputation destroyed by MGM's smear campaign. She never successfully pursued her dreams of stardom. The Douglas case wasn't an isolated incident. It was a window into how the studio system operated when its interests were threatened. The same tactics used against Patricia would be deployed repeatedly: witness intimidation, evidence suppression, bribery, and the deployment of private security forces to silence victims. This was Jeffrey Epstein's playbook, executed 90 years earlier, with the same methodical precision and institutional protection. The MGM empire and its hidden operations. To understand how MGM could allegedly run such operations, you need to grasp the sheer scope of their power. MGM wasn't just a movie company. They were an entertainment monopoly that controlled American popular culture from coast to coast. Jeffrey Epstein ran a criminal network, but MGM ran an entire industry. Founded in 1924 through a merger of Metro Pictures, Goldwyn Pictures, and Louis B. Mayer Pictures, MGM quickly became what they proudly called having more stars than there are in heaven. Under the leadership of Louis B. Mayer and production chief Irving Thalberg, they generated profits that made them one of America's most valuable corporations. But this success came with unprecedented control over human beings. The 7-year contract system essentially turned performers into studio property. Stars couldn't work elsewhere, couldn't choose their roles, couldn't even date without studio approval. This legal framework created perfect conditions for exploitation, since performers had zero recourse when executives crossed boundaries. The studio system gave executives unprecedented control over their contracted performers, creating a perfect environment for exploitation, as vulnerable performers had no recourse when studio executives crossed boundaries. The economic monopoly enjoyed by major studios eliminated alternative power centers that might have provided protection for victims or accountability for perpetrators. With 5 studios controlling production, distribution, and exhibition, there were no meaningful external authorities to appeal to when abuse occurred within the system. This monopolistic structure made resistance practically impossible for individuals dependent on the industry for their livelihoods. According to LAist's investigation into Golden Age Hollywood's underground economy, MGM's alleged operations were remarkably sophisticated. The studio reportedly used its extensive wardrobe, makeup, and hairdressing departments to transform women into convincing replicas of its biggest stars. Women were allegedly dressed in actual costumes from major films, including reportedly using Gone with the Wind costumes to create Scarlett O'Hara lookalikes for wealthy clients. Check the description for all sources and additional details. The operation was reportedly overseen by MGM's extensive network of fixers, studio employees whose job was to handle any situation that might damage the studio's reputation. Chief among these was Eddie Mannix, MGM's general manager, and Howard Strickling, the head of publicity. These individuals had connections throughout Los Angeles law enforcement, city government, and the press. When problems arose, they made them disappear. Film historian E.J. Fleming documented in The Fixers how this system worked. According to Fleming's research, the studio maintained facilities where actress Billie Bennett allegedly received direct assistance from MGM, with the studio using her establishment to entertain clients. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was reportedly integrated into the studio's business model. Meanwhile, Mark Elliott's biography of Jimmy Stewart revealed even more disturbing details. According to Elliott's research, MGM operated facilities directly adjacent to their Culver City studio. When studio executives became suspicious of Stewart's quiet lifestyle, they allegedly ordered him to visit these facilities to prove his manhood. One executive reportedly told Stewart, "Get your ass over there and get those rocks off with at least 2 of those broads." This wasn't just about providing services, it was about control. By compromising their own stars and creating networks of dependence and secrets, the studio ensured loyalty and silence. Anyone who might speak out could be destroyed, not just professionally, but personally. The women used in these operations were often aspiring actresses who had come to Hollywood with dreams of stardom. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a system that treated them as disposable commodities. According to historical accounts cited by LAist, these women were subjected to extensive abuse, forced to service multiple clients per day, denied medical care when ill, and paid only half of their promised compensation. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as anything Epstein's network employed. Women were isolated from support systems, made financially dependent on their exploiters, and threatened with career destruction if they spoke out. In an era when women had few legal protections and even fewer economic opportunities, resistance seemed futile. The geographic concentration of the industry in Los Angeles created a closed, social, and professional environment where studio influence could be exercised across all relevant institutions. The same fixers who suppressed studio scandals maintained relationships with local law enforcement, political leaders, medical professionals, and media outlets. This comprehensive control meant that victims had no independent institutions to turn to for help. The professional incentive structures within the industry rewarded participation in exploitative systems while punishing resistance. Agents, publicists, journalists, and other industry professionals advanced their careers by maintaining studio relationships and keeping studio secrets. Those who challenged the system found themselves excluded from professional opportunities, creating powerful incentives for complicity. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did researching it, hit subscribe. We dig into Hollywood's hidden history every week. Hollywood's scandal suppression machine. The real power behind Hollywood's exploitation network wasn't the perpetrators. It was the sophisticated machinery that ensured scandals never reached the public. This system, centered at MGM but extending throughout the industry, operated like organized crime with law enforcement connections, political influence, and unlimited financial resources. Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling weren't just publicity executives. They were the architects of America's most comprehensive scandal suppression operation. From the 1930s through the 1960s, these 2 individuals operated what Atlas Obscura described as Hollywood's most sophisticated crisis management system. The scope of their activities reads like a criminal enterprise manual. According to documented accounts, Mannix and Strickling arranged secret medical procedures for unwed MGM actresses, including Jean Harlow, Judy Garland, and Lana Turner, using false identities and fabricated medical conditions. They created an entire security operation called the Tracy Squad. Doctors, security personnel, and ambulance drivers whose sole job was monitoring Spencer Tracy's alcohol issues and removing him from public situations before his behavior became visible. But their most sinister work involved suppressing assault cases like Patricia Douglas's. The fixers' approach was methodical: witness intimidation, evidence destruction, media manipulation, and legal obstruction through corruption and political influence. Mannix had extensive connections to organized crime through his background in amusement park operations, which often served as fronts for criminal enterprises. These connections proved useful when studio problems required more aggressive solutions than legal or financial pressure could provide. The fixers maintained relationships throughout Los Angeles' power structure. District attorneys, police commissioners, judges, and newspaper editors all received studio benefits in exchange for cooperation when scandals arose. This created a system where criminal behavior by studio personnel could be suppressed at multiple levels simultaneously. Their techniques mirror those used by modern criminal enterprises, like Epstein's network, which allegedly used compromising information to maintain silence. The fixers collected secrets about everyone they dealt with, not just to suppress damaging information about their clients, but to have leverage over potential threats. The psychological warfare they employed against victims was particularly sophisticated. In Patricia Douglas's case, they didn't just deny the assault. They systematically destroyed her credibility through character assassination, making her appear unstable and unreliable. They turned other victims against her, creating a narrative where speaking out meant facing not just studio wrath, but peer rejection. The fixers pioneered legal strategies still used today to suppress assault cases. They delayed proceedings through procedural challenges, overwhelmed victims with expensive legal costs, and used private investigators to dig up compromising information about accusers that could be used for character assassination or leverage. When direct suppression wasn't possible, they controlled narratives through media manipulation. The fixers maintained close relationships with gossip columnists and entertainment reporters, feeding them approved stories while threatening career destruction for unauthorized information. This created a compliant press that functioned essentially as studio publicity extensions. The system was so effective that most crimes they covered up remained hidden for decades. Unlike modern cases where social media and independent journalism can expose powerful networks, the fixers operated when information could be completely controlled by a small number of institutions. Perhaps most importantly, the fixers ensured their criminal enterprise remained invisible to the public. While everyone knew Hollywood had publicity departments, few understood these individuals were operating sophisticated criminal conspiracies that enabled serious crimes, including assault and exploitation. This invisibility was crucial to their success. By maintaining facades of glamour and respectability, studios could continue operating exploitation networks while victims remained isolated, without credible avenues for seeking justice. From MGM Studios to Epstein's Island, the blueprint evolves. The operational similarities between Hollywood's Golden Age exploitation network and modern cases like Jeffrey Epstein's operation are striking and reveal how power-based exploitation has evolved while maintaining consistent core elements. Like MGM's operations, Epstein's network relied on luxury settings and celebrity connections to normalize exploitation, where MGM used actual movie costumes and studio facilities to create atmospheres of glamour and legitimacy. Epstein used private jets, luxury properties, and connections to powerful figures to create similar senses of exclusive access and privilege. Both networks targeted vulnerable young women with promises of career advancement and elite connections. MGM's operation allegedly recruited aspiring actresses with promises of movie roles, while Epstein's network targeted young women with offers of modeling opportunities, educational funding, and introductions to wealthy benefactors. In both cases, initial recruitment involved legitimate seeming opportunities that gradually revealed their true exploitative nature. The infrastructure supporting both networks was remarkably similar. Just as MGM employed fixers like Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling to suppress scandals and silence victims, Epstein maintained extensive networks of lawyers, publicists, private investigators, and political connections to protect his operation and intimidate potential witnesses. The psychological manipulation techniques were nearly identical. Both networks used isolation from support systems, financial dependence, and threats of career or social destruction to maintain victim compliance. The normalization of abuse through gradual escalation, celebrity participation, and luxury settings made victims question their own perceptions of exploitation. Sean Combs's alleged activities represent another evolution of the same basic model. Like MGM's parties for Chicago exhibitors and Epstein's gatherings for elite clients, these events allegedly combined professional networking with exploitation, making it difficult for participants to distinguish between legitimate business activities and criminal abuse. The role of institutional protection remains consistent across all three cases. MGM used influence over law enforcement, politics, and media to suppress investigations and control narratives. Epstein's network included politicians, prosecutors, and media figures who helped maintain his immunity from accountability. Current allegations suggest similar protective mechanisms around powerful entertainment figures today. The documentation and evidence patterns also show remarkable consistency. In all three cases, the most damaging evidence, photos, videos, witness testimony, has been systematically suppressed, destroyed, or made inaccessible to victims and investigators. The recent Department of Justice memo denying the existence of an Epstein client list mirrors MGM's successful suppression of film evidence from Patricia Douglas's assault. The conspiracy theories surrounding both modern cases also reflect patterns established during Hollywood's golden age. Public fascination with hidden networks of elite exploitation, secret recordings used for blackmail, and institutional cover-ups all have roots in documented realities of how the studio system operated. Modern technology has evolved the methods, but not fundamental dynamics. Where MGM fixers used private investigators and newspaper relationships to control information, modern networks use digital surveillance, social media manipulation, and legal threats to achieve similar results. The speed and scale have changed, but basic techniques of victim isolation, witness intimidation, and narrative control remain the same. Legal strategies employed by modern defendants also mirror those pioneered by Hollywood fixers. Character assassination of accusers, procedural delays, overwhelming legal costs, and behind-the-scenes settlements all became standard practice during the Golden Age and continue being used today. Perhaps most significantly, both historical and contemporary cases reveal how wealth and celebrity status can create functional immunity from criminal prosecution. The same mechanisms that protected MGM's network for decades, political influence, media control, and unlimited financial resources, continue shielding powerful individuals from accountability today. The persistence of these patterns across nearly a century suggests they represent fundamental features of how power-based exploitation operates in American society, rather than isolated historical anomalies or contemporary aberrations. The broader network, Scotty Bowers, and Hollywood's underground economy. While MGM's institutional operations remained largely hidden, another aspect of Hollywood's exploitation network operated more openly, though still largely in the shadows. This was the world documented by Scotty Bowers in his controversial 2012 memoir, Full Service: My Adventures in Hollywood and the Secret Lives of the Stars. Bowers, a World War II Marine veteran, claimed to have operated what was essentially a matchmaking service for Hollywood's elite from the 1940s through the 1980s, initially based out of a Richfield gas station on Hollywood Boulevard. His memoir details thousands of encounters he allegedly arranged for major stars, both male and female. While fact-checkers like Larry Harnish have raised legitimate questions about the verifiability of many of Bowers's specific claims, noting the lack of photographic evidence, inscribed photos, or contemporary documentation, the broader patterns he describes align with other documented accounts of Hollywood's underground economy. According to Bowers, his operation wasn't technically illegal in the legal sense, but rather a sophisticated matchmaking service that connected consenting adults. However, the power dynamics he describes mirror those found in modern trafficking cases. Vulnerable individuals, often aspiring performers desperate for career opportunities, were connected with powerful industry figures who could make or break their futures. The gas station became a hub for this activity, with Bowers employing what he claimed was a small army of escorts to serve a clientele during an era when certain lifestyles were not only socially unacceptable, but criminally prosecuted. The secrecy required by these circumstances created perfect conditions for exploitation and abuse. What makes Bowers' account significant isn't necessarily the accuracy of every detail he provides, but rather how it illustrates the systematic nature of exploitation in Golden Age Hollywood. His descriptions of recruitment methods, the use of private locations, the involvement of industry insiders, and the absolute requirement for secrecy all mirror the operational patterns we see in documented modern trafficking cases. Bowers describes a network that extended far beyond his gas station operation. He claims connections to high-end establishments, private parties at Hollywood mansions, and exclusive gatherings where entertainment industry figures mixed with politicians, business leaders, and other powerful individuals. These gatherings, according to Bowers, often involved activities that participants needed to keep secret for both professional and legal reasons. The psychological dynamics Bowers describes are particularly revealing. Many of his clients, he claimed, were trapped by the Hollywood closet, individuals whose careers would be destroyed if their private lives became public knowledge. This created a dependency relationship where clients needed his discretion to maintain their public personas. Similarly, many of the women and men who worked in his network were aspiring performers who hoped that connections made through these services might lead to career opportunities. This created the same power imbalance we see in modern cases. Vulnerable individuals providing services to powerful people who controlled their professional futures. The secrecy surrounding these operations also enabled abuse. When activities are hidden from public view and participants can't speak openly about what occurs, there's little accountability for exploitation or violence. Bowers himself admits that he had no oversight of what happened once he made introductions, and participants had little recourse if situations became abusive. Bowers' account also reveals the extensive network of industry insiders who facilitated these operations. He describes connections with studio publicity departments, talent agents, private investigators, and other Hollywood service providers who helped maintain secrecy and provide logistics for the network's activities. This infrastructure, the combination of powerful clients, vulnerable service providers, industry insider facilitation, and absolute secrecy, created conditions remarkably similar to what prosecutors have described in the Epstein and Combs cases. The technology and specific methods may have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. The recruitment methods Bowers describes were sophisticated and targeted. He would identify vulnerable individuals through various means, sometimes through referrals from industry contacts, sometimes by approaching people directly who appeared to be struggling financially or professionally. The initial approach was often framed as an opportunity for legitimate work or career advancement. The financial arrangements Bowers describes also mirror modern trafficking patterns. Participants were often promised significant payments, but found themselves in situations where they were financially dependent on continued participation. The promise of future opportunities, whether career advancement or financial security, kept many people trapped in situations they might otherwise have left. Bowers' account reveals how the same institutional protection mechanisms that shielded MGM's operations also protected his network. Law enforcement officials who were compromised by their own participation or by financial relationships with the entertainment industry turned blind eyes to activities that were clearly outside legal boundaries. The normalization of exploitation that Bowers describes was facilitated by the participation of respected industry figures. When powerful directors, producers, and stars were involved in these networks, it became easier for victims to rationalize their participation as simply part of how the entertainment industry operated. The human cost, understanding the victims. Understanding the full scope of Hollywood's Golden Age exploitation network requires examining not just perpetrators and their methods, but the devastating impact on victims. Unlike modern trafficking cases where victims can potentially access support services, legal advocacy, and public attention, Golden Age victims faced complete institutional abandonment. The psychological profile of these victims reveals systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals. Most were young women from working-class backgrounds who had traveled to Hollywood with dreams of stardom. Separated from family support systems, financially desperate, and lacking industry connections, they were perfect targets for exploitation. Patricia Douglas exemplified this vulnerability. At 20, she was supporting herself as a dancer while dreaming of movie stardom. Like thousands of other young women, she trusted that responding to a studio casting call would be safe and potentially career advancing. The betrayal of that trust, being deceived into attending what was essentially a private entertainment event, created lasting psychological trauma that destroyed her confidence and ability to pursue her dreams. The studio system's complete control over entertainment careers meant victims faced impossible choices. Speaking out against powerful individuals didn't just risk their own futures, it could destroy their family's economic stability and any chance of working in their chosen field. This created a form of psychological captivity as effective as physical imprisonment. The isolation these victims experienced was profound. Unlike modern survivors who can find support through advocacy organizations, online communities, or sympathetic media coverage, Golden Age victims were completely alone. Studios controlled all mainstream media coverage, ensuring victim perspectives never reached the public. Support services for assault survivors didn't exist, and legal protections were minimal. The trauma was compounded by victim-blaming tactics that were even more extreme than those used today. In Patricia Douglas's case, MGM's campaign didn't just question her credibility. They painted her as someone who had invited the assault through her behavior. This character assassination continued for months, destroying not just her career prospects, but her social relationships and self-esteem. For women trapped in MGM's alleged system, psychological manipulation was even more sophisticated. According to historical accounts, these women were often told they were auditioning for legitimate roles or being trained for future film opportunities. The gradual revelation that they were actually being prepared for exploitation created forms of psychological trauma, similar to what modern trafficking survivors describe. The use of Hollywood glamour as a tool of exploitation was particularly psychologically damaging. Women were dressed in actual movie costumes, given professional hair and makeup, and told they were living their Hollywood dreams. This blending of fantasy and exploitation created confusion about their situation that made resistance more difficult. Economic control exercised over these women was total. Like modern trafficking victims, they often found themselves financially dependent on their exploiters, making it practically impossible to leave even when they understood their situation. Promises of future opportunities kept many trapped long after they realized the true nature of their circumstances. The physical abuse many suffered was compounded by medical neglect. The studio system's control over health care meant that victims often received inadequate or inappropriate treatment, designed more to hide evidence than provide healing. In Douglas's case, the immediate medical response, a cold water douche that destroyed forensic evidence, prioritized studio legal protection over the victim's medical needs. The long-term psychological consequences were devastating. Many victims never recovered their sense of self-worth or ability to form healthy relationships. The combination of trauma, professional disappointment, social isolation, and economic hardship created patterns of depression, substance abuse, and self-destructive behavior that lasted for decades. Perhaps most tragically, many victims blamed themselves for their exploitation. The studio's sophisticated gaslighting campaigns convinced women that they had somehow brought their abuse upon themselves by being too trusting, too ambitious, or too naive. This internalized shame prevented many from ever seeking help or speaking about their experiences. The silence these victims maintained wasn't just about fear, it was about survival. In an era when assault victims were often blamed more than their attackers, and when women had few economic opportunities outside marriage or entertainment, speaking out could mean complete social and economic destruction. The systematic nature of this victimization reveals how institutional power can create conditions where large-scale exploitation becomes normalized and invisible. When entire industries operate to protect perpetrators while isolating and silencing victims, criminal behavior can continue for decades without accountability. The cultural mythology surrounding Hollywood's success created psychological conditions that made exploitation seem acceptable or even necessary. The narrative that stardom required extraordinary sacrifice and that moral compromises were part of paying dues normalized exploitation as an inevitable part of the business. This cultural framework made victims less likely to recognize abuse and more likely to blame themselves for their experiences. The technological and communication limitations of the era aided institutional control by preventing victims from organizing or sharing information effectively. Without modern communication tools, isolated victims couldn't connect with others who had similar experiences or coordinate resistance efforts. This isolation was carefully maintained by studios through geographic dispersion of potential witnesses and active surveillance of anyone who might cause problems. The cover-up machinery in motion. The successful suppression of Hollywood's exploitation networks for nearly 90 years required sophisticated coordination across multiple institutions and decades of consistent execution. Examining specific cases reveals the machinery of cover-up in operation and explains how criminal enterprises can maintain immunity from accountability, even when their activities are partially exposed. The Patricia Douglas case provides the clearest documentation of this machinery in action. Within hours of the assault, MGM's response was swift, comprehensive, and coordinated across multiple fronts simultaneously. This wasn't improvised crisis management. It was the execution of pre-planned protocols designed to handle exactly this type of situation. The immediate medical response, taking Douglas to a hospital where evidence was destroyed before any forensic examination, reveals preparation and coordination with healthcare professionals. The doctor who performed the evidence-destroying procedure was clearly acting in the studio's interests, rather than providing appropriate medical care. This suggests systematic corruption of medical professionals who could be relied upon to prioritize studio protection over patient care or legal requirements. The deployment of Pinkerton detectives to intimidate witnesses demonstrates the studio's access to sophisticated private security services willing to engage in criminal behavior. The systematic tracking down of every woman who attended the party and the coordination of their coerced testimony required extensive resources and professional expertise in witness manipulation. This wasn't ad hoc intimidation. It was a comprehensive intelligence operation. The corruption of key witness Clement Soth through job offers reveals how economic leverage was systematically used to purchase testimony. The offer of any job he wanted at MGM wasn't a spontaneous bribe. It was part of a structured approach to identifying and neutralizing potential threats through targeted incentives. The coordination with law enforcement officials demonstrates how corruption functioned at institutional levels rather than just individual relationships. District Attorney Buren Fitz's failure to pursue the case aggressively wasn't just personal corruption. It was part of systematic arrangements between studios and law enforcement that prioritized studio interests over criminal justice. The media suppression reveals sophisticated information control operations that extended far beyond simple publicity management. The complete absence of coverage in mainstream press, despite the dramatic nature of the allegations, demonstrates coordinated suppression across multiple publications and reporters. This required ongoing relationships and systematic arrangements rather than case-by-case persuasion. The legal strategy employed, procedural delays, overwhelming Douglas with costs, and ultimately achieving dismissal through apparent behind-the-scenes settlement, demonstrates sophisticated legal expertise specifically designed to suppress criminal cases while minimizing public exposure. This suggests retained specialists who had developed expertise in assault case suppression. The long-term maintenance of secrecy reveals ongoing institutional commitment to suppression that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The film evidence remained hidden in MGM vaults for decades. Archived materials were curated to exclude damaging information, and official studio histories omitted any reference to the incident. This systematic historical erasure required consistent institutional commitment across multiple generations of studio management. The coordination across different types of institutions, medical, legal, law enforcement, private security, media, and political, demonstrates a network of corruption that extended throughout Los Angeles' power structure. This wasn't just studio influence, it was systematic institutional capture that made cover-ups possible across all relevant sectors simultaneously. The psychological warfare employed against Douglas, character assassination, social isolation, and economic pressure required sophisticated understanding of victim psychology and systematic application of pressure across multiple domains of her life. This suggests expertise in victim silencing that had been developed through previous cases and refined through experience. The successful suppression of the case for over 60 years demonstrates the effectiveness of these methods when applied systematically with sufficient resources. The machinery was so effective that most historians of Hollywood's golden age were unaware the incident had occurred, despite its documentation in legal records and witness testimony. Modern examples reveal how this machinery has evolved while maintaining core functions. The same basic elements: immediate evidence control, witness intimidation, legal strategy designed for suppression rather than resolution, media coordination, and long-term institutional commitment to secrecy continue to be employed in contemporary cases involving powerful individuals and institutions. The consistency of these patterns across different eras, industries, and specific cases suggests that cover-up machinery represents a systematic feature of how powerful institutions protect themselves from accountability rather than isolated examples of corruption or individual criminal behavior. Why these stories stayed buried for nearly a century. The successful suppression of Golden Age Hollywood's exploitation networks for nearly 90 years reveals sophisticated institutional mechanisms for historical erasure that continue to operate today. Understanding why these stories remained hidden illuminates broader patterns of how powerful institutions control historical narratives and public memory. The primary mechanism was complete media control. During the Golden Age, a small number of studios controlled not just film production, but also much of the entertainment press. Gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, who seemed to report scandals freely, actually operated within strict boundaries set by studio publicity departments. Stories that threatened fundamental studio interests simply never appeared in any mainstream publication. This control extended beyond entertainment media. Studios maintained extensive relationships with newspaper editors, radio broadcasters, and magazine publishers throughout the country. Through advertising revenue, exclusive access to stars, and direct financial relationships, they could suppress stories nationwide. Local law enforcement and political coverage was similarly controlled through the same financial and political relationships that prevented criminal prosecutions. Academic and historical institutions also played a role in this suppression. Early film histories were often written by industry insiders or with studio cooperation, creating sanitized narratives that focused on artistic achievements while ignoring systematic criminal behavior. University film programs, often dependent on industry funding and access, similarly avoided controversial subjects that might threaten those relationships. The legal system's role in suppression was equally important. Through extensive settlements that included non-disclosure agreements, studios could silence victims while avoiding public trials that might reveal damaging information. The Patricia Douglas case, for example, appears to have been resolved through behind-the-scenes agreements that kept the full extent of MGM's involvement from public scrutiny. The professional incentives for researchers and journalists also contributed to ongoing suppression. Investigating powerful historical figures and institutions requires extensive resources and often results in legal threats that can destroy careers. Publishers and media companies, many with ongoing relationships to entertainment companies, have little incentive to support expensive, controversial investigations of historical subjects. Social and cultural factors have also played a role. The mythologizing of Golden Age Hollywood as a period of innocence and glamour makes the public resistant to information that contradicts cherished beliefs about beloved stars and classic films. This nostalgia creates market pressure for sanitized histories and resistance to more complex, disturbing truths. The destruction and suppression of primary source evidence has been systematic and ongoing. Studio archives, when they were donated to universities or museums, were carefully curated to exclude the most damaging material. Private papers of key figures like Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling were likely destroyed or remain in private hands where they can't be accessed by researchers. The passage of time has also aided suppression. Most direct participants in these networks are now deceased, eliminating the possibility of first-hand testimony. Secondary sources like Scotty Bowers' memoir, while valuable, can be dismissed as unverifiable or exaggerated, allowing defenders of official narratives to avoid engaging with uncomfortable truths. Modern entertainment companies have inherited both the archives and the legal interests of Golden Age studios, creating ongoing institutional incentives to suppress damaging historical information. Acknowledging systematic criminal behavior by predecessor companies could create legal liabilities and damage valuable brand assets associated with classic films and star personas. The complexity of the subject matter also aids suppression. Understanding these networks requires knowledge of multiple interconnected systems, studio operations, law enforcement corruption, political influence, media control, and criminal enterprises. This complexity makes it difficult for casual researchers to investigate effectively and allows defenders to dismiss partial revelations as incomplete or misleading. Current legal and social dynamics continue to favor suppression over disclosure. The same legal strategies that protected studios in the 1930s, character assassination of accusers, claims of fabrication or exaggeration, and overwhelming legal resources continue to be effective today. Victims or their families who might consider speaking out face the same risks of financial ruin and public humiliation that silenced their predecessors. The ongoing power of entertainment companies to control historical narratives through their influence over media, publishing, and academic institutions means that even when evidence emerges, it can be marginalized or discredited before gaining widespread public attention. The institutional architecture of exploitation, the systematic nature of Golden Age. Hollywood's exploitation networks reveals how institutional power can create environments where criminal behavior becomes normalized and perpetuated across multiple generations of participants. Understanding this framework illuminates why similar patterns continue to emerge in modern cases. The studio contract system created the foundational conditions for exploitation by establishing legal ownership relationships between studios and performers. 7-year contracts gave studios complete control over their talents' professional activities, personal appearances, and even private relationships. This legal framework made performers effectively property of the studios, removing their autonomy and creating dependency relationships that could be leveraged for exploitation. The economic monopoly enjoyed by major studios eliminated alternative power centers that might have provided protection for victims or accountability for perpetrators. With 5 studios controlling production, distribution, and exhibition, there were no meaningful external authorities to appeal to when abuse occurred within the system. This monopolistic structure made resistance practically impossible for individuals dependent on the industry for their livelihoods. The geographic concentration of the industry in Los Angeles created a closed social and professional environment where studio influence could be exercised across all relevant institutions. The same fixers who suppressed studio scandals maintained relationships with local law enforcement, political leaders, medical professionals, and media outlets. This comprehensive control meant that victims had no independent institutions to turn to for help. The professional incentive structures within the industry rewarded participation in exploitative systems while punishing resistance. Agents, publicists, journalists, and other industry professionals advanced their careers by maintaining studio relationships and keeping studio secrets. Those who challenged the system found themselves excluded from professional opportunities, creating powerful incentives for complicity. The cultural mythology surrounding Hollywood's success created psychological conditions that made exploitation seem acceptable or even necessary. The narrative that stardom required extraordinary sacrifice, and that moral compromises were part of paying due, normalized exploitation as an inevitable part of the business. This cultural framework made victims less likely to recognize abuse and more likely to blame themselves for their experiences. The technological and communication limitations of the era aided institutional control by preventing victims from organizing or sharing information effectively. Without modern communication tools, isolated victims couldn't connect with others who had similar experiences or coordinate resistance effort. This isolation was carefully maintained by studios through geographic dispersion of potential witnesses and active surveillance of anyone who might cause problems. The legal system of the era provided minimal protections for assault victims while offering extensive protections for wealthy defendants. Cases were extremely difficult to prosecute successfully, particularly when defendants had access to sophisticated legal representation and political influence. This legal environment made criminal behavior practically risk-free for powerful individuals while leaving victims with little recourse. The absence of social services or advocacy organizations meant that victims had no institutional support outside of family or friends, who often lacked the resources or knowledge to provide effective help. This isolation compounded trauma and made recovery more difficult, while also eliminating potential sources of public exposure or political pressure for reform. The hierarchical nature of studio operations created multiple layers of plausible deniability that protected top executives from direct accountability. By using intermediaries like fixers, talent agents, and security personnel to facilitate exploitative activities, studio heads could maintain distance from criminal behavior while still controlling and benefiting from it. The integration of legitimate business activities with criminal enterprises made it difficult for participants to distinguish between legal and illegal behavior. When exploitation occurred within professional contexts, like auditions, business meetings, or industry parties, victims and witnesses often struggled to understand whether they had witnessed crimes or simply inappropriate but legal behavior. These institutional frameworks didn't disappear with the end of the studio system. Many of the same elements, concentrated economic power, geographic clustering, professional incentive structures that reward complicity, cultural mythologies that normalize exploitation, and legal systems that favor wealthy defendants, continue to exist in modern entertainment and other industries. Why these revelations are finally surfacing. The emergence of these stories after nearly 9 decades of successful suppression reflects broader changes in media, technology, and social attitudes that have weakened traditional mechanisms of institutional control over historical narrative. Understanding why these revelations are surfacing now illuminates both the persistence of cover-up systems and their increasing vulnerability to exposure. The decline of traditional media gatekeepers has been crucial to enabling these revelations. During the Golden Age, a small number of newspapers, magazines, and broadcasters could effectively suppress any story through coordinated action. Modern digital media has democratized information distribution, making it impossible for even powerful institutions to control all potential outlets for damaging information. Social media platforms have enabled victims and researchers to connect across geographic and temporal boundaries in ways that were impossible during the Golden Age. Modern survivors of trafficking and exploitation can share information about historical patterns that validate their own experiences, while researchers can coordinate investigations across multiple institutions and archives. The changing legal landscape around assault has also enabled historical investigation in new ways. Modern understanding of trauma psychology, victim behavior, and institutional abuse patterns makes historical accounts more credible to contemporary audiences. Legal developments like extended statutes of limitations and class action mechanisms have created incentives for victims to come forward even decades after abuse occurred. The Me Too movement specifically created cultural conditions where allegations against powerful figures are taken more seriously and victims face less stigma for speaking out. This cultural shift has made it safer for aging survivors to share experiences they kept secret for decades, while also making audiences more receptive to accounts of systematic abuse by entertainment industry figures. Academic and journalistic institutions have become more independent from entertainment industry influence and more willing to investigate controversial subjects. The professionalization of film studies and the growth of investigative journalism have created communities of researchers with different incentive structures than earlier generations who were more dependent on industry cooperation. The economic changes in the entertainment industry have also reduced the power of traditional studios to suppress unfavorable coverage. The breakup of the studio system, the rise of independent media companies, and the globalization of entertainment have created more diverse power centers that are less easily controlled by any single set of institutional relationship. Technological advances in archival research have made it possible to uncover suppressed documents and evidence that was previously inaccessible. Digital archives, search capabilities, and networking among researchers have revealed patterns of evidence that were invisible when documents could only be accessed individually in physical locations. The aging and passing of participants in cover-up operations has also reduced resistance to exposure. Many of the fixers, executives, and other institutional figures who maintain secrecy are no longer alive to defend their legacies or protect institutional interests. Their successors often lack the same personal investment in maintaining historical cover-up. Legal changes around estate management and institutional archives have made some previously suppressed materials accessible to researchers. As private papers are donated to universities, and as corporate archives are transferred or reorganized, materials that were carefully curated to exclude damaging information sometimes surface through oversight or changing institutional priority. The success of modern investigations into figures like Jeffrey Epstein and Sean Combs has also created public appetite for similar historical revelations. Audiences who understand how modern exploitation networks operate are more prepared to accept that similar systems existed in earlier eras, making them receptive to historical accounts that would have seemed incredible to previous generations. The economic incentives for exposure have also changed. Books, documentaries, and articles about historical scandals now represent viable commercial opportunities in ways that weren't available when traditional media could suppress coverage. This has created financial incentives for researchers and journalists to investigate subjects that were previously considered too risky or unrewarding. However, the persistence of some suppression mechanisms means that many aspects of these historical networks likely remain hidden. Corporate successor institutions still have legal and financial incentives to suppress damaging historical information, and many of the most powerful families and institutions involved in Golden Age exploitation maintain influence over media and academic institutions. The contemporary revelations likely represent only partial disclosure of the full extent of Golden Age exploitation network. The most damaging evidence remains suppressed, key witnesses have passed away without testifying, and institutional pressure continues to discourage complete investigation of these subjects. The enduring blueprint of institutional exploitation. The systematic exploitation networks that operated during Hollywood's Golden Age weren't historical curiosities. They were blueprints for how concentrated power, institutional protection, and systematic victim silencing can enable criminal enterprises to operate with impunity for decades. The parallels between MGM's alleged operations and modern cases like Jeffrey Epstein's network reveal consistent patterns that transcend specific eras or technologies. The evidence we've examined, from film historians E.J. Fleming and Mark Elliott's documented accounts of MGM's alleged operations, to the meticulously documented Patricia Douglas case, to the systematic cover-up machinery operated by fixers like Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling, reveals sophisticated criminal enterprises that used entertainment industry resources to facilitate exploitation while maintaining complete legal immunity. These weren't isolated incidents of individual misconduct, but systematic operations integrated into the business models of major entertainment companies. The use of studio resources, costumes from major films, professional makeup and hairdressing departments, secure locations, and extensive security apparatus to facilitate exploitation demonstrates institutional commitment rather than rogue behavior by individual employees. The victims of these networks aspiring actresses deceived about auditions, dancers tricked into attending private parties, vulnerable women promised career opportunities, faced the same isolation, economic dependence, and psychological manipulation that characterizes modern trafficking cases. Their experiences reveal how institutional power can create conditions where exploitation becomes normalized and resistance appears futile. The machinery of suppression that protected these networks, witness intimidation, evidence destruction, media control, legal manipulation, and political corruption, pioneered techniques that continue to be employed today. The successful suppression of these stories for nearly 90 years demonstrates how effectively powerful institutions can control historical narratives when they have sufficient resources and systematic approaches to information control. The parallels with contemporary cases are undeniable. The same patterns of recruitment, exploitation, psychological control, and institutional protection that characterized MGM's operations appear in the allegations against Jeffrey Epstein and Sean Combs. The consistency of these patterns across nearly a century suggests they represent fundamental features of how power-based exploitation operates rather than historical curiosities. What makes these historical cases particularly significant is their successful suppression for so long. Unlike modern cases where social media, independent journalism, and changed legal standards create possibilities for exposure and accountability, Golden Age victims faced complete institutional abandonment. Their stories were erased so thoroughly that most film historians were unaware they existed until very recently. The emergence of these accounts now reflects changing power structures in media, technology, and society that have weakened traditional mechanisms of institutional control. However, many aspects of these historical networks likely remain hidden, and the basic institutional structures that enabled them continue to exist in modern form. The lesson isn't just that powerful individuals have always engaged in exploitation. It's that institutions can be structured to enable, facilitate, and protect such behavior while maintaining public facades of respectability and legal immunity. Understanding historical patterns is crucial for recognizing how similar systems operate today and might be prevented in the future. The victims of these networks deserved justice they never received and recognition they were systematically denied. Their stories reveal the true cost of institutional power when it operates without accountability or oversight. Remembering their experiences honors their suffering while illuminating ongoing patterns of exploitation that continue to destroy lives today. The golden age of Hollywood may have ended decades ago, but the institutional frameworks that enabled systematic exploitation continue to evolve and adapt. Only by understanding how these systems have operated historically can we hope to recognize and resist them in their contemporary forms. If stories like these matter to you, if you believe in uncovering truths that powerful institutions would prefer to stay buried, then you're exactly who this channel is for. We dive deep into the histories they don't want you to know, connecting dots between past and present that reveal how power really operates. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue exposing the patterns that shape our world. Your support helps us keep digging where others won't dare to look.